So this one comes from the New York Times. Can a new change government change Israel? This one's interesting. It's by Isabel Kirshner, and you might actually be shocked to hear what's happening with this next Israeli government. So first, let's quickly discuss what recently occurred in Israel. If you are living under a rock, you may not know that Israel and Gaza had a brief war. I believe it lasted like around a week, maybe a little bit longer. And this very brief war was actually a huge, huge deal in the West. It actually led to a decrease of Western support for Israel when the West has generally tended to support Israel in a variety of different capacities over the past, like since 1948, frankly. And basically now you have a new government happening in Israel as a result of a variety of recent elections, and this election now has resulted in a new government. So Benjamin Netanyahu, who was actually the longest-serving prime minister in Israeli history, and, of course, a far-right figure. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu was prime minister from 1996 to 1999, and he lost 1999 because he was probably extremely corrupt. And the other thing is that he actually was too left-wing. He wasn't left-wing. He was too centrist, too moderate, I should say, for the far-right. And he was actually, of course, right-wing, so he was not going to be supported by the left. And I think Ehud Barak beat him in a prime ministerial race. And as a result, Benjamin Netanyahu, realizing that he had lost the right and that had actually led to his loss, he moved to the right and then ran for prime minister, I believe, again in 2009. And he won on a right-wing platform. And of course, over the next 10 years, he continued ratcheting the country's politics to the right. He very famously came to the United States and he berated Barack Obama for his treatment of Israel, supposedly in the eyes of Likud, which is his primary party. The Likud is a far-right party in Israel, which many parties are far-right in Israel, but Likud is definitely far-right. And Likud had a variety of different issues that plagued it. Primarily, a bunch of wars occurred during Likud's time. The 2014 Gaza war, the one that recently occurred, of course, and a variety of other different flare-ups that occurred during Likud's time in power. And also, Likud had issues from the right, from like Netanyahu's right. So Netanyahu was a right-wing figure, but he even had opposition from the far right, which he had during his first prime minister term. And as a result, Netanyahu is facing some problems in Israel. And that's probably an understatement because he has now recently lost his election. So Netanyahu is also facing corruption charges. And he generally, when you face corruption charges, as like in America, you can claim parliamentary immunity. So in Israel, it's parliamentary immunity. Sometimes in America, it's called executive privilege. And Netanyahu is basically claiming this immunity so that he can't be prosecuted, but he won't be able to do that anymore if he loses his prime minister seat, which it seems like he will. So basically, there is a new prime minister, but that prime minister may not be who you think it is. It is not a center-left leader. The center-left did not actually defeat. Well, I guess center-left did defeat Netanyahu, but the center-left is not leading the coalition at this precise moment. The leader of the coalition, the person who will be made prime minister after Netanyahu leaves, is actually Naftali Bennett. And Naftali Bennett is the leader of the far-right Yamina party. And Yamina is actually not a very popular party in Israel. It only received 7 seats in the in the parliament. Now, these 7 seats are important because you need to get 61 seats, I believe, to get a majority. And Netanyahu had 52 seats. Likud had 30 seats, but Netanyahu's coalition had 52 seats. And Yair Lapid, the leader of a centrist party in Israel, and that party is not the Blue and Whites. It is the successor to the Blue and Whites. But Yair Lapid is the centrist leader of the Israeli opposition, and he only had 45 seats. So it seemed like Likud was better seated to get a parliamentary majority. But the issue is that when you have 52 seats and 45 seats, the question is, how can you get more seats? And Likud had basically reached its ceiling maybe if they had gotten Yamina on their side, they would have gotten 59 seats, but actually you need 61 to become the prime minister. So it seemed like Likud was never going to become prime minister, and you'd probably just get another election. Now, Israel had many elections because this situation had continued to occur. So if you can't get a coalition, you actually have to you have to go to another election. And in that case, Israel would go to another election, and they had already had, I believe, 4 elections in the past 3 years. I could be getting those numbers wrong, but it was a lot of elections. So that meant that Yair Lapid had to build his own party, and from there, so first, Blue and White had actually broken apart as a result of this, of the issues that had occurred during the Israeli coalition fights in 2020 and 2019. Blue and White had sort of like completely fallen apart as a result, but still, despite that, Blue and White could form their own, they could still work together and form a coalition to defeat Netanyahu, but they just weren't running together on the same ticket. Now, Lapid, who is I believe a newscaster, I think he's, I forget why he's important, but he is like a newscaster. He's fairly well known in Israel, and he is a pretty clear centrist. So he wasn't really offensive to anyone, and as a result, Lapid was able to sort of scrounge together his own coalition. And that coalition, number one, that coalition included not only his own party, not only the most of Blue and White, but he also got the New Hope Party, which is a center-right party, to join him, and he got some of the Joint List parties. The Joint List is a coalition between a variety of different Arab Israeli parties. You may not know this, but actually Arabs can vote in Israeli elections. It's just a lot of times the Arab parties choose not to participate inside the government as an act of protest. This is something generally called abstentionism, but that's not what abstentionism is directly. However, that being said, a lot of these Arab parties don't join governments. However, at this point, in order to take out Netanyahu, Joint List decided to give Lapid a lot of support. Now, not only Joint List gave Lapid support, but also another Arab Israeli party called Ram gave Lapid its support. Now, Ram is led by Mansour Abbas. Mansour Abbas is an interesting leader. He has represented his constituents, which are Arab Israelis, well. However, from a Western progressive standpoint, you may think that Ram and Abbas are distasteful. I believe as a result of this coalition, Ram sort of imposed on the coalition as part of it joining that there would be no future LGBT laws passed, at least under the coalition. And frankly, that probably wasn't going to happen anyway. But it just tells you what Ram is as a party. And Ram's support, Ram was never going to support Netanyahu, but Ram's support was integral in getting Lapid over the top. And so Yair Lapid, again, the leader of the opposition, he now needed a few more votes, and those votes had to come from the far-right Yamina party. So the Yamina party is a far-right party. There are so many parties in Israel, by the way, that it's extremely difficult to keep in track of all of them. I believe Yamina is a split-off of Likud, because Likud was too centrist for Yamina. I don't know necessarily, and Yamina may be a different party, but basically, the important thing to know is that Naftali Bennett is in control in Yamina. So Naftali Bennett has a lot of different things that are pretty crazy of him. So Bennett actually, his votes were necessary, and as a result, Lapid had to give him something so that he would join the coalition to oust Netanyahu. This coalition was pretty widespread, but it was primarily in the center-left. So Naftali Bennett decided to join, but only if he would become the prime minister. And as a result, he will be the prime minister for a primarily centrist government, even though he is on the far right. So to discuss a few things that Bennett believes, Bennett does not recognize Palestine in the same way that, like, Hamas doesn't recognize Israel. Bennett does not believe Palestine has a right to exist. He supports, and that's, by the way, that's more far right than Netanyahu's position. He also supports settlements, which, as we discussed, settlements have sort of completely destroyed a lot of the Israel-Palestine peace process that had been occurring since the Oslo Accords in the 1990s. By the way, he also dictates what is occurring inside the coalition because he is a prime minister. So even though he's only serving until 2023, when most prime ministers serve for 4 years, and Lapid is coming in after him. He's a sort of two-stater, meaning he supports a two-state solution, and he's more of a liberal. So Lapid will serve from 2023 to 2025, and Bennett will serve until 2023. So that being said, Bennett and Lapid will sort of hold this rickety government together with duct tape and tax. It is not held together very well. I guess duct tape is kind of a good thing to hold something rickety together, but it's not being held very well. You know what? It's not duct tape. It's not even tax. It's like scotch tape. So it's as strong a government as you would expect, which is to say not very strong, because the government is made up of far-right people to the right of Netanyahu, people who are centrist, people who are left, and Arab Israelis. Just everyone who just doesn't like Netanyahu. So it sort of was building up for 10 years. Netanyahu was eventually going to lose, and it seems like he lost in the weirdest way possible with a government of everyone who hates him. How fitting. Okay. So we have discussed Israel and Palestine in the past. We had an entire segment, I think 90 minutes, of Israel-Palestine that we did, I believe, it might have been a month ago by now. And this Israel-Palestine video is still available. If you go to linktr.com/raymondperez, you can still view the 3 episodes directly related to the Israel-Palestine conflict. I'll see you here next time in the next video. If you're watching the podcast, continue watching. But if you're watching the YouTube video, we will see you next time where we discuss the only successful Green Party. Very interesting.